everyone. I'm a host of PeaceEver TV. Today we're at UN Plaza 777 with Bruce Knott here. And Bruce is the co-chair of the UN NGO Committee on Human Rights, the chair of the NGO Committee on Human Rights, the chair of the NGO Committee on Disarmament, Peace and Security, a member of the NGO UN Security Council Working Group. Welcome, Bruce.
Thank you. Good to be here.
So we're gonna start with a warming up question.
Okay.
So the 67th DPI NGO conference is gonna be held in New York this summer. So what do you think, if you can give us some previews of the topics and maybe some hot issues that are gonna be discussed in the conference this year?
So it's going to be on August 22nd and 23rd. And we are going to be talking about positioning, the repositioning of the United Nations to fulfill the Sustainable Development Goals. The United Nations is somewhat challenged these days. The United States has lowered its contributions to the UN, so the budgets are getting tighter, and I think Secretary General Gutierrez really wants to get the best bang for the buck, make sure that each dollar that the UN has is used to the maximum effectiveness. And so we want to discuss that. And I think the first day will be on that topic, discussing what the UN is planning to fulfill the Sustainable Development Goals in an era of decreasing budgets.
Mm-hmm.
The second day, we want it to be kind of like our previous communications workshops, where we work with NGOs to help them be the best kind of NGOs that they can possibly be, to do their work most effectively, and to be helpful to the United Nations.
Mm-hmm.
So the first day will be kind of content, and the second day is how to be a good NGO.
I see. So speaking of sustainable subjects, what do you think is the hottest issue that's going to be discussed within the subject?
Well, I think the UN's primary purpose, of course, is peace,
Mm-hmm.
and I think there's a fair amount of instability in the world right now, so I can see us talking about peace. We also are faced with the existential threat of climate change, and so I know climate change will be a big topic. The primary goals, the first two goals on the Sustainable Development Goals, is ending poverty and ending hunger. And in many ways we see that on the increase in many parts of the world, although many parts of the world are now better off than they used to be. And so we hope to look at countries that have done very well in eliminating poverty and hunger, such as China, and use those examples that they have, those methodologies that they've had to eliminate poverty and to eliminate hunger, and take those to the countries that are still struggling with those issues.
I see. Thank you for answering that. And so I mean, for the sustainable development, and I know that from your resume that you actually worked on that issue for a long time. So the weather is very abnormal, especially in New York right now. It's raining, it's pouring outside, and it was snowing yesterday. Do you think that's actually related to the climate change, or the global climate change, or it's just a...
No, absolutely. The weather is not what it's supposed to be. And if you talk to anybody around the world, and you ask them, particularly older people, so maybe people like me, is this weather usual? And everywhere you go in the world, say no, the weather is not what it's supposed to be. I mean, spring isn't happening the way it should be, winter is not happening, fall and summer are not happening the way they should be. A lot of the weather problems, I think, have to do with water. Many countries don't have the rainfall that they need to grow their crops, and so they're suffering from droughts. Other parts of the world are experiencing floods that they never had before. So it's either too much water or too little water. We had the chance, we've known about climate change for about 50 years, and we really haven't done what we needed to do to stop it. So it's here. We can slow it down, we can mitigate it, we can deal with it, But we can't stop it now. That time has already passed, so we have to live with it, and we have to find ways, I think, to help each other. I don't think it's a productive way for countries just to go it alone.
Mm-hmm.
And I think there is kind of a mindset, well, we're just going to protect our country
Mm-hmm.
and make sure everything is fine for us and to hell with the rest of the world.
Right.
And I don't think that's the right answer. I think that's the wrong answer.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think we should work together with the United Nations to build cooperative agreements so that we can solve these problems on a global level, because I think that's much more productive than each country trying to solve the problems on their own.
Yes, I completely agree. So is there any detailed procedures or methodologies are already developed for the collaboration, the global collaboration?
Well, we're working on that. I mean, the Paris Climate Accords, I think, are a great guide to what we need to do on climate change. There will be a summit here at the United Nations in September on migration, which is a very big issue and related to climate change, because a lot of people are moving away from where they're living. Some 67.5 million people, largest number of people ever since the Second World War, are leaving their homes because of issues. Sometimes they're conflict issues, or political issues, but at the base, there's usually a climate change dimension to it. For example, I mean, probably the biggest catastrophe right now that we're facing is the civil war in Syria. What happened in Syria prior to the civil war was a 12-year drought. And so people moved off their farms because they couldn't farm anymore. They moved into cities. They started demanding services from the government, which they weren't getting from the government. And so they started the civil war against this government that was either incapable or unwilling to provide those services. So we look at the politics and the religious dimension of the conflict, and sometimes we forget it started with a 12-year drought. It started with a climate change impetus that started the whole thing. And I think if we look at a lot of the reasons why people are leaving their countries, at some level, climate change is part of the problem.
I see. Thank you for that. So now I'm gonna change to like a little bit different direction. So you worked for a lot of nonprofit organizations, and on your resume, I actually read that you had the experience and ability to make sure the financial stability in those areas that you actually helped with. So do you have a financial background? I see that you actually have a business background. Do you want to tell us like an interesting story about one of those nonprofits that you worked with and helped them? Actually, I think one of those is in the worst economic time, and you managed to still raise their profits, raise the what's it called, the power to a newer level. So how did you manage to do that? Would you like to give us an example?
Well, actually, most of my background has been in government. I was an American diplomat for 25 years. Probably the job that I enjoyed the most and felt the most fulfilled in was as the regional refugee coordinator for West Africa. And I really felt the world was not paying enough attention to what was happening in that part of West Africa. Primarily, we were looking at the Liberian and Sierra Leone refugee situations, and the world was kind of ignoring it. And so I started writing messages talking about the problem, the terrible situation that the refugees were in, to my government, to Washington. And somebody back in Washington leaked my messages to the High Commissioner for Refugees, and at the time it was Ruud Lubbers, who happened to be a former Dutch Prime Minister, and he was brand new, and he decided to make his first visit as High Commissioner for Refugees to West Africa, to my region. and he came with the International Press Corps, and he said, "This is the worst refugee crisis in the world," which is exactly what I wanted him to say, because he got the press attention to what was going on, and then the money started flowing. I made a pitch to President Clinton before he left office, and he used his executive authority to give $5 million more for refugee assistance. Then we had the new President Bush, George Bush, came into office. I made an appeal to him, and he gave us $12 million more in refugee funding. So we had $17 million between the two presidents, and that certainly helped deal with the refugee crisis in both Liberia and Sierra Leone. So I felt very good about that. But a lot of that was just telling the story and telling it in a compelling way. Because these refugee camps in Guinea had been attacked by rebels, and so the refugees were running around in the bush. They needed greater food supplies because they weren't just sitting, they were in some distress. And I was also dismayed because the area was dangerous. I went to those areas, but many NGOs and even the UN staff were afraid to go to those areas. So these refugees were in really bad shape. And so I was able to tell that story in a very compelling way, and it changed the behavior of the UN. The UN started sending emergency staff to deal with the situation, and my government gave more money. Then I did something else. I met with two friends. One of them was Eric de Feiter from the Dutch Embassy and Alberto Passini from the European Commission. And what we were finding is that some countries were duplicating the efforts of other countries. So there was duplication, and then there were areas where no country was helping. And I said, if all of the countries would just lay out their assistance programs side by side, we would be able to see where are the holes and where are the duplications. So we started a donor conference, the three of us, and we invited all the governments of the world to come and basically let us know what they're doing in West Africa. And where there was duplication, we ended the duplication. Where there were holes in the assistance, we plugged those holes. We got people to help with that. For example, the United States government was willing to provide seeds and tools for agriculture. They were not willing to provide fertilizer, because sometimes fertilizer can be used to make bombs. And the United States is very kind of nervous about terrorism and bombs, so the United States would not provide fertilizer. But the Dutch government was willing to provide fertilizer. So the United States government provided seeds and tools, and the Dutch government provided the fertilizers. So in that way, we were able to make sure that all the bases were covered. And what one country couldn't do, another country could do, and they could solve the problems.
Right. And how long it takes for all this, for example?
We had our donor conference. I was there for 3 years, and we had a donor conference every year. And what of course happened, it wasn't just donors. Then all the NGOs came with their hands out and said, okay, we want some of this money. And so it became a dialogue between the NGOs that were looking for money and the donor countries that had the money. And so we would dialogue together and figure out again how to best spend the money so that we would have maximum impact. We would cover the basic needs of the people in the region, and not duplicate, not waste money. We wanted to make sure that every bit of money that we used was being used to maximum effect. And the only way to do that was for countries to cooperate and share the information. Which countries sometimes don't want to do, but if everybody would share what they were doing, then we'd look on the table and say, okay, we're doing this, you can do that, and we would come up with solutions.
That's great. Thank you so much for sharing that. So, speaking of non-profits, especially fundraising, I see that you're really good at when a non-profit is in a bad situation, but help them to actually be in a good situation. And what do you think is the key to do that?
Well, the same thing that I just said,
Mhm.
I took that experience that I had in government,
Mhm.
where I was able to get more money from my government by telling a very compelling story that was fact-based. I mean, I wasn't making this stuff up. It wasn't fake news. It was what was really happening. But I was able to talk about what was happening in the region. So I do the same thing as a nonprofit leader, and I talk about, what the problem is, how our NGO is solving the problem, and why we should be funded. I was, for example, the executive director of the Literacy Council of Prince George's County, Maryland. It has a very high dropout rate, particularly at grade 9. A lot of high school students leave high school at grade 9, which means they're not graduated from high school.
Right.
And if you don't have a high school degree here in the United States, you don't have a chance of getting a job. With a 9th grade education, your prospects for the future are very low. And so we provided GED classes, which basically was a high school diploma equivalent, and helped those students who had dropped out in high school go back to school, get their high school equivalency, and hopefully go on to get good employment. And that's a very compelling story. And I was, again, able to tell that to donors, to grant foundations, and we got something like $21 million in additional funding to make sure that we did that kind of education. We also helped immigrant people who came in and needed to learn English. We had a very touching student. She was Ethiopian, and she worked nights as a cleaning lady in a school, actually. And her daughter came to the United States as a fairly young girl. So the daughter was growing up in the United States, and she was learning English. The mother, who was working, really wasn't learning English. And what finally happened is that the mother and daughter couldn't even talk to each other.
Oh, I see.
Because the mother knew Amharic and the daughter knew English.
Yeah.
And so the mother wanted to learn English so she could speak to her daughter. So we had those kinds of cases, and having ESL classes, English as a second language classes, first of all, helped these immigrants to better function and get jobs and employment and function in American society. And in this particular case, it helped the mother and the daughter to have a language they could talk to each other.
Great. That's a great story right there.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you.
So another question would be